So, does Franco Colapinto deserve his F1 seat? Yes. Yes, he does. And I'm more than happy to tell you why, since his 5-race trial is almost up. Before Spain, I was a little unsure. But after that, and especially after Montreal, I am far more convinced. You out there, though, are a little bit less convinced than I, with the resounding vibe via Twitter and then on YouTube being a resounding meh, and then maybe an okay, so it's a little bit in the middle. It's average, middling, so-so. It's not downright disastrous at the very least. But quite honestly, I think Franco is the least of Alpine's problems right now, because the team's main beneficiary, their main champion, Luca Di Maio, who is now the former CEO of Renault Group, has parted company. The guy who insisted on rebranding Renault to Alpine to lower expectations to showcase their sports car division. So the only way that I think that Renault Alpine have emulated the front-running pack is that they copied Ferrari and their team boss strategy. And throughout all of this, Pierre Gasly is just watching things fall apart around him, just going like, this is nothing like it was 3 years ago. He's calling for unity, to focus on next year. Yes, I know, the team is focusing on next year, and they are getting Mercedes power, but his future is looking incredibly muddled, as is everyone else. Except for Franco. The truth is that he's taken over Alpine's second seat at the worst possible time, right when the team has hit its roughest patch in years, both in terms of performance, management, and investment. This slump does not look good at all. Not to other drivers looking for a seat, because they don't want to touch this with a 10-foot pole, not to sponsors, not to the celebrity investors who collectively own a quarter of the team, and then the final diuretic pigeon on the statue, Nico Rosberg calling what is going on at Alpine damaging to the brand. And then what was also damaging to the brand was the dismissal of one Jack Doohan within 6 races. He got even less time than Nick De Vries, and we all thought that was harsh. But I am about to throw some stats in your direction, so I am backing up what I'm saying here with, well, results. And then when it comes to non-classifications, Jack Doohan has 2, Franco, he's got a clean sheet. Their average finishing positions, Jack is at 14.75, Franco at 14.25. Rounded, that's P15 for Doohan, and P14 for Colapinto. It's a slim difference, but considering Franco's much lower mileage in the car when you really look at it, it is impressive. Now, what makes this statistic even more interesting is that when you bring in the Frenchman Pierre Gasly into the mix, his average finishing position whilst the teammate of Doohan was P11. With Franco, in those 4 races, it's P12. So when you look at it in terms of the brass tacks, and that is where you finish on the Sunday, Franco is closer to Gasly than Jack was with more experience. In short, the driver swap was worth it. Franco is closer to Gasly, and what makes it even more notable is that this is in a period where the car is objectively worse than it was in the start of the season, when you could say that Alpine were always a regular shout in terms of a point or two. Honestly, it would have been ideal if we just had a split down the middle in terms of 12 races for Jack, 12 races for Franco, and then that would have decided what we'd have seen in 2026. Oh well, Flavio's an impatient man, what more can we do here? At least Franco is getting an opportunity after what he was able to do in 2024. And there are other reasons why I think Franco getting the seat has actually been a net positive call, and I am more than happy to share with you, and if you like what I've got to say, then like the video. I would like to begin my justification by going back to what Jack Doohan said before the 2024 season began, before we then found out that, oh my god, the A524 is a bag of bolts. That, and all the carbon fibre! Doohan said that outside of the current F1 grid, he was definitely the driver with the highest mileage in the machinery, and that, as he put it, was in all kind of conditions, hinting that he was a very versatile driver who could cope with all kinds of likely scenarios. Now, granted, that kind of rhetoric from a reserve driver is very punchy, and it had enough spirit in which to aid Briatore when he took over in charge alongside Oliver Oakes in making the call to sign on Jack early into 2024. What Jack was able to do in the FP1 sessions he was then afforded was enough to relieve Esteban Ocon of his duty and suffering for the Abu Dhabi Grand Prix, which in a byproduct meant that Esteban couldn't have a proper goodbye until several weeks later, and therefore Jack got an extra turn of the wheel around Abu Dhabi. And admittedly, his results were, anonymous. And what really didn't help was that Abu Dhabi was the track that he had plenty of that mileage in a Formula 1 car. And at a time where the A524 had finally found its feet, and Pierre Gasly was able to work wonders with some good top 5 finishes on merit, especially around Qatar. You could have expected Jack to at least maybe close to points, but No, we didn't get that. But as we know, despite all that testing before 2024 and the subsequent distance travelled in said race and in pre-season testing for the following year, it didn't produce the desired competitiveness, especially when you look at Colapinto's numbers with him having far less time testing-wise. And that's one important thing to point out to you, because in comparison, Jack Doohan has had thousands and thousands of kilometers in Alpine cars, plenty of data for the testing team to pass through, whereas Colapinto, yes, he has had plenty of time in the Williams simulator, and he did get several races in the FW46, but that car is completely different to what the A523, the A522, the A525, which Franco has now actually sampled. And in terms of preparation for 2025, the amount that Jack got in comparison to Franco, well, it's night and day. Yes, Alpine have been quick to rectify that situation. He has had a good several hundred kilometers of testing in other machinery like the A523 alongside the other reserve driver Paul Aaron. But you've really got to look at the longer term picture here. The amount of testing time that Jack Doohan had received, because he stepped in right at the moment when Alpine's contractual team dropped the ball super hard and allowed Oscar Piastri to skedaddle over to McLaren because, well, they didn't regulate and formulate their paperwork properly. They left it so open. So with Oscar gone, that was their long-term prospect, so then they had to bring up Jack, and therefore he got the treatment that Oscar was going to be afforded. And say what you will about Alpine, the main Formula One team, Alpine's testing team is a really impressive operation which knows its stuff and has plenty of machinery to work with. They are very committed. It's a very good unit. And when it comes to Jack himself, he's no slouch. He is a hard worker. He has plenty of that Aussie grit, as did his father Mick Doohan back in the day in motorcycles. He had to work hard for that, and yes, he is a driver under the influence of Flavio Briatore, as in Flavio is his manager, but still, he had to convince Flavio to commit to him, and as we saw in that Drive to Survive section, Flavio was not going to give him an easy ride, and it was certainly made even harder when Franco arrived, and then Briatore obviously got buyer's remorse. But either way, Jack put in the time and effort to at least secure a kind of race seat, so I will give him credit for that one. But the fact of the matter is, though, is that in the time that he had been received, he just didn't impress. He wasn't competitive. And if the trend that Colapinto is establishing right now continues to, slowly rise and rise and rise, then the chances of getting back in the seat for maybe another few races or so to see whether he could have kicked on after more time in the simulator, since he is the team's main reserve driver now, yeah, it's going to diminish those odds. Alpine's engineers do rate Jack highly, though, and former team boss Oliver Oakes was very complimentary of him for his commitment and usefulness. The team saw Doohan's mileage also as useful for long-run correlation, yet it just didn't translate into a consistent race day gap to Pierre. Colapinto, though, with roughly one-third of the seat time depending on where you look, has statistically beaten Doohan's average finishing position and cut the deficit to Gasly, a very important marker, especially if Alpine managed to reduce the weight of their car and find some upgrades, which means a double points finish. What can Alpine infer from all of this? Okay, let's just be honest here. Right now, Alpine's car is simply not competitive. You've only got to look at what's going on at Sauber. Under the management of Wheatley and Binotto, the upgrades are actually producing results that are allowing Nico Hülkenberg to score points and qualify well. And Bortoletto in the fullness of time will more than likely catch up, even though he himself has admitted that Nico can simply do things he can't, but that's okay. He's a rookie. And as for Franco, I think he's doing just as well. Because Franco so far has a clean sheet. Touch wood, I am not jinxing that. And Gasly, he has fallen back from the main pack, and they are closer and closer to converging and not being all that much different. All of this despite the Argentinian joining in a very rough patch. And again, you've got to look at the stuff other than the race results, in that so far, Franco has had no retirements in the race, and I know you're going to be bringing up that Q1 crash where he completely totaled the car, but that was under pressure, whereas the crash that Jack Doohan had in Suzuka practice was, accordingly to Alpine, self-inflicted, him trying to do something that the simulator said was possible, but in reality, it was not. So that was down to driver error and computer error in terms of giving Jack false hope. And not to mention, in the time comparison, Franco has had a clean sheet with the stewards, whereas in the time that Jack Doohan was in the second Alpine seat, 4 penalty points in 6 races. That's not good, and if that trend continued where there was a lot of aggressive scruffiness, then that could have easily resulted in a race ban, and Franco may have gotten the seat in that case anyway. And also, with budgets being really tight at the moment, and ideally teams would like to be under the cost caps, that means maybe more resources could be dedicated to 2026, every single clean finish counts. And Franco is proving to be reliable as of now, so that could be a valuable asset in of itself. Now, could Jack still get a second chance, a second bite of the Alpine apple, unless Jack has been able to do wonders in the simulator and provided some very valuable setup information which has benefited both Pierre and Franco? I don't really see putting him in the car will make much difference. That all of the testing time and mileage they put into the Australian before he started his race career with Alpine, it doesn't really bode for any major uptick in performance. That's just the simple truth. And look, I'm not hating on Doohan. I'm glad he got a chance and that he was able to at least have a try of realising his Formula One dream, but the situation was clear. It was not Alpine, the best team in which to find your feet. It's a team in flux and looking to transform itself, and Jack's timing was just poor. No fault of his own, it's down to the management. The next checkpoint, I think, will come after the British Grand Prix, since that 5-race period is now not going to happen. But we will then have 6 races for Franco, 6 races for Jack. So that means we can then get an even stronger comparison and sample size than we have right now. And if Franco keeps on performing well at the next 2 tracks, which he does know very well from F3 and F2, then it's going to be looking very, very good for Franco, especially if he can maintain the interest from Argentina sponsorship-wise, if he can get the fans even more behind him, and most importantly, he doesn't crash. And the sponsorship thing could be very, very crucial in terms of securing Alpine's long-term future, especially when the cost cap goes up next year to 220 million. And no, I'm not inferring that Franco is a paid driver. He is not. He is a driver who had to mostly self-fund his path to F2, and then when he got the Williams call-up, more Argentinian backing came his way. So he had to plug at it for a very long time, and then suddenly people were going like, oh wow, this kid's good. Money, 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 money. And I think for Alpine, if Franco continues to improve, it could be a very valuable backup plan in case BWT chooses to leave. And therefore Alpine needs a brand new title sponsor. So someone like Globant, who is increasing its partnership with Formula One itself. Maybe YPF could come in with some more money, Mercado Libre. It's all depending, really. Who's going to get the title rights if BWT abandons the team? Next, I want to talk about Canada. While Spain looked particularly spicy for Franco in Q1, his push to qualify higher there was curtailed thanks to a drivetrain issue, which resulted in a new gearbox for the race. By the way, replacing said box is no longer subject to a grid drop. In the next race, though, without a doubt, Colapinto turned up, narrowly missing out on Q3 at a power circuit, as we know Alpine would have understandably struggled at. And let me make this clear here. The Montreal circuit, the Circuit de Gilles Villeneuve, is a track that Franco has never been to before. F2 and F3 don't go here. And then, courtesy of motorsport data analyst Lucas Corsino via user at Felauso, the fundamental truth is that despite Franco starting P10, and therefore in a points position, the chances of Franco converting that successfully were very low, him probably being unable to defend down the long straights, with the Renault engine at least 3 miles an hour slower there than the Ferrari unit in the back of the Saubers that were running rings around him. Put simply, traffic and dirty air and the lack of oomph meant that the Alpine was powerless to resist and fell back from the likes of Hulkenberg. I don't think we are going to be seeing a repeat of Baku where Franco got a record P8 finish behind Albon, because that is a very, very power-heavy circuit, and Renault can't do anything about that in terms of the engine development because it's been frozen since 2022, thanks to Christian Horner and Red Bull pleading to the FIA regulators and the F1 gods for clemency, allowing them to build up their powertrains division and then not also having to focus on improving the current engine. Given the history between Renault and Red Bull, Christian Horner's team got the last laugh in that regard. Renault have been unable to get faster. So with all of that into consideration, you could argue that Franco is bedding himself in really well within the Alpine team and with the A525. That sure, it was a very tricky beginning at the likes of Imola, but over time he has been able to get at least some understanding of the car, which means that there are moments when you do look at what's going on and go, wow, he's actually really good, and how did Franco get that? Pierre, what? And James Vowles, his former boss at Williams, has still been talking about Franco despite him no longer being part of the racing academy. Him telling the paddock to give Franco time to settle in and using a very, very valuable comparison which is increasingly relevant and glaringly obvious in terms of adaptation. It's what you see with Carlos Sainz coming here as an example. A world-class driver. It takes time to get up to speed in the car, and Colapinto jumped in halfway through the season, as he did with us as well, and he had some races that were very strong, some races that took a little bit more time. I think the ask I have of everyone is whether it's Franco or others, give them time. It does take time to settle into a car. Now, that is very intriguing and flattering, since James is comparing Franco to Carlos. James is throwing Colapinto a bone here, a bone which is increasingly relevant since if there is anyone who knows the potential of Franco, it's James. Early ups and downs are not an ultimate verdict on speed. He also reminds Alpine that Franco has already shown flashes of form and suggests consistency will come once he learns the car's quirks. The subtext? Judge Franco over months, not weekends, and keep backing him as a long-term asset. Which he is. He's got a 5-year deal overall with the Alpine team. Yeah, I do hear you that Jack Doohan should have been afforded the same thing. Like I mentioned earlier, ideally, what they should have done if they were going to do a mid-season driver swap is give 12 races to Jack, 12 races to Franco, and then decide who will get the seat for the entirety of 2026. But I then counter by just asking you to go back to what Jack said in February of 2024. Him singing from the rooftops that, I've got so much experience at Alpine, I've got thousands of miles in test mileage. And if Jack had scored at least 1 point in those first 6 races, he would have gotten that seat committed for the rest of the season, no doubt. The task was clear, 1 single point, and he couldn't do it. And that was with an Alpine team that looked very much within the midfield fold, whereas now it's very much the back marker at the moment. And what really doesn't help Jack is that Alpine knows every single grain of information from the telemetry regarding his potential, and they still made that decision. They still made that call. They committed to Colapinto. So, like I mentioned earlier, the only way I see Jack getting back in that car is if he comes up with something in the simulator which turns out to be absolute gold dust. That gives Alpine 3 or 4 tenths without them having to bolt on brand new parts. That maybe there is something in the data that they missed, and therefore the optimization and efficiency of the current A525 is then unlocked and unleashed. But I do think it's an uphill struggle for the Australian because Briatore is very much focused on the Argentinian in many aspects, especially when it comes to the commercial opportunity. All the drivers have some kind of support, financially speaking. And it doesn't help Jack that Briatore has effectively walked back his 5-race plan for Franco, now stating that he's in the seat effectively indefinitely. In fact, he stated it so hard to be fact, he's even suggested to the press that it was them who made up the 5-race claim. But in reality, Flav, you did say it, that the 5 race after Doohan's dropping would give us an opportunity to ride something different, and then as our options. Either way, that has nothing to do with Franco as a driver. It's all about how he and the swapping of drivers was managed, and it was cack-handedly. And it really didn't help matters that people were a little bit dubious regarding Franco, since yes, he had a very good start with Williams back in 2024, but then when the pressure and the attention rose and rose and rose to that, not that dissimilar from some of the big name drivers in the midfield or the bottom of the front running pack, it crumbled. Franco knows that he had an opportunity to maybe get within with the front running pack immediately, and he botched it. And Franco did show humility, which was commendable, and he was very grateful for the opportunity afforded to him by the likes of Briatore, who nursed the talents and potential of one Michael Schumacher and one Fernando Alonso, and of course one Mark Webber. But no doubting, the attitude toward the Argentinian has certainly cooled. But having said that though, maybe Alpine's descent in performance could be a blessing in disguise. As we have seen many times, if you're near the back, then not many as people care about you and you don't make many headlines. That, well, you're not likely to score a point, so what's the point of even covering you? You're going to be around the back. But in Montreal, we came close to something pretty notable. Franco scoring a point. Yes, it was looking very unlikely, again, around a power circuit, but if that had happened, it would have been more impressive Franco getting a P10 or something than it would have been had Jack got a P10. Because Alpine were more competitive just a couple of months ago. Because back then, they were easily the 5th or 6th fastest car, so getting a cheeky P9 or 10, yeah, that was very much doable. Now, it's not likely. It could be very much track dependent, or if something happens in Q2 that throws Alpine a lifeline, like it did with Franco, in both Hadjar and Tsunoda getting grid drop penalties, and therefore that elevated Franco in to P10, giving him that Q3 appearance without actually getting into Q3. And then there's Gasly himself to consider. As you can probably imagine, Pierre doesn't really look all that invincible at the moment. He understandably is also quite on edge, because not only is the car falling away from their rivals in the midfield, but there have been several instances where strategy has made his weekend even harder to manifest points. And then there are the notable mistakes, such as at Imola, where he went wide fighting a Ferrari, and then his crash in Monaco, which saw him retire, and you've got yourself a driver clearly not at ease with the team or with his car. In fact, you see Pierre more often than not screaming from the rooftops for some sort of order to happen, that there needs to be a review of absolutely everything, that Alpine is in a shambles, and that he has to be the linchpin to keep everyone focused on 2026, when maybe the worm could turn. And it's vitally important because this is a very important phase of Pierre's career. Now that he is approaching 30, he is going to have to make a very major decision about where he commits for the next few years. He either remains with this team and continues to be their leader, or try and use next year as a jumping off point to maybe land a position with a true front-running pack, whoever gets the 2026 regulations correct. Should Alpine fail to convert and they remain in P6, P7 or worse, then I don't think that Pierre's clout within the driver market will be all that great, and he may have very little wiggle room, so he would have no choice but to stay at Alpine or exit F1 altogether. And when you consider that Briatore is not always Pierre's biggest fan, it can ebb and flow at every other race weekend, it doesn't make Gasly's job security look all that great. In contrast, Franco's seat looks reasonably safe in the short to medium term, even with Alpine's turbulence in all respects. Because let's be real, Colapinto had no chance of a Williams seat in the short term because Alex and Carlos are a very strong double act which Vowles would ideally like to keep around for as long as possible. James himself recently locking in his own long-term contract to remain team boss there. What Pierre needs to do now is to rally the troops. And if there's anyone that Pierre doesn't want to have the last laugh with, it's Esteban. And what doesn't help is that in a situation where Alpine don't look competitive, Franco is closer to him than Jack was close to Pierre. So that is already a little bit of a teeny tiny red flag in the Frenchman's mind, that he may not be as big of a fish as he was with the Australian. Because what we're seeing from Franco throughout all of this is not dumb luck that he's closer to Pierre, it's that he is very good at adapting. Sure, De Meo's exit removes a key supporter, but also the budget-heavy Renault engine project which costs hundreds of millions of dollars per year. And whilst it removes some French authenticity from the team, the savings from buying customer power units can now be allocated to improving the team at large. So I do think Franco's job is secure here because he's the least of the wider Alpine group's worries. He is a constant, and if he continues to bring in constantly decent results and then maybe a quieter set up to the points paying positions, especially if Alpine can get their upgrades right like they did last year, then I think that Colapinto could be around for a good long time. And if an opportunity at Williams comes around again, and Williams turn out to be one of the best teams around and continue to be for the rest of the decade, then easily I could imagine James will just take Franco back to either replace Alex or Carlos should they decide to move on. Because whatever happens, I think Colapinto is going somewhere, because he's hitting every single target that Alpine is setting right now. Unless something dramatic happens, such as another big major crash which cost several $100 million, Gasly suddenly having a massive uptick which then skews the averages back toward Doohan, then I think Franco's safe. Speaking of things that are safe, the whole Mercedes-George Russell thing and the question over 2026, that's an interesting one. And to find out why I think it all makes sense what's happening with Toto and George, watch this video next, straight after this one.